What would you do if you discovered your best friend didn't die in a tragic accident, but was sacrificed by a cold-blooded boss? And now that same man is driving his widow and child to the brink of death. 41-year-old billionaire William had been lied to for 3 years, until a 9-year-old girl unexpectedly called his secret private number in the middle of the night. The innocence of a starving orphan just ignited the most ruthless purge among the elite, where true evil will pay the ultimate price, losing an entire empire. The snow had been falling since noon, and by the time the clock on William Hargrove's mantle struck 9, the whole of Greenwich, Connecticut had buried itself under a thick white silence. The lights on the Christmas tree in the corner of his living room blinked on and off in a slow, mechanical rhythm, casting red and gold shadows across the walls of a house that was far too large for one man. William sat in the leather armchair nearest the fireplace, a glass of bourbon resting untouched on the side table, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Outside, somewhere down the long private drive, a wreath hung on the iron gate. His housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, had put it there 3 days ago, and William had not had the heart to ask her to take it down. Christmas was not something he celebrated anymore. It had not been something he celebrated in 4 years. He was 41 years old and worth somewhere north of $3 billion, depending on the market on any given Tuesday. He owned stakes in shipping companies, a renewable energy firm in Austin, a small but profitable chain of boutique hotels along the eastern seaboard, and a technology startup in San Francisco that everyone in Silicon Valley was watching with cautious envy. His name appeared on Forbes lists and in the business sections of newspapers. People called him visionary, disciplined, relentless. His attorneys called him 3 times a week. His personal assistant, Daniel, called him every morning at 7:15. His mother called on Sundays, always hoping he would come home to Charleston for the holidays, always receiving the same gentle but firm decline. Nobody else called. Which is why, when his personal cell phone buzzed against the side table at 9:17 on Christmas Eve, William's first instinct was to ignore it. It was the phone he gave to almost no one. Not even Daniel had that number, only his lawyers, his accountant, and 3 people in the world he considered close enough to call a friend. He glanced at the screen. The number was local, a Connecticut area code, but he did not recognize it. He let it ring twice more, then picked up. "Hello." There was a pause. Then a small voice, thin as a thread, came through the line. Hi. Is this Mr. Hargrove? Mr. William Hargrove." William straightened in his chair. "Yes." "Who is this?" Another pause. He could hear breathing, careful, controlled breathing, the kind a child does when they are trying very hard not to cry. "My name is Jenny. Jenny Carter. I'm sorry to call so late. I know it's Christmas Eve and I know you probably don't know me, and I'm really sorry if I'm bothering you. I just didn't know who else to call." William set the glass of bourbon down. "Jenny," he said slowly, "how old are you?" "9, she said. "I'll be 10 in March." "Okay." He kept his voice calm, the same voice he used in boardrooms when things were going sideways and he needed to steady the room. "How did you get this number, Jenny?" "From a picture," she said. "A photograph. It was in my mama's drawer in a box she keeps under her bed. I wasn't snooping, I promise. I was looking for the extra blanket because the heat's not working right and Mama's sick and I was cold. And I found the box and inside there was a picture of my daddy and a man who I think is you because Mama told me once that you and Daddy were best friends. And on the back of the picture someone wrote a phone number. I didn't know if it was still your number. I hoped it was." William had stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of that sentence. He pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes. "What was your daddy's name?" he asked, though some part of him already knew. "Marcus," she said. "Marcus Carter." The fire crackled. The Christmas tree blinked. Outside, the snow kept falling, indifferent and beautiful, and William Hargrove sat very still in the chair where he had been sitting alone all evening, and felt the past come rushing back like a flood through a broken dam. Marcus Carter. The name landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He had not said that name out loud in over 2 years, not since he had come back from his work in London and learned, through a mutual acquaintance at a charity dinner in Manhattan, that Marcus had died. A workplace accident, someone had said, at one of the manufacturing plants somewhere in the state. William had stood there with a glass of wine in his hand, and heard the words and felt the floor shift beneath him. He had not known. He had been abroad for nearly 8 months, and when he returned, everything in his personal life had already collapsed around him, and somewhere in the wreckage of his own grief he had failed to reach out, failed to ask questions, failed to find out what had happened to the family of the man who had once been the closest thing he had to a brother. "Jenny," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, rougher at the edges. "I knew your father. I knew him very well. He was a good man. One of the best I've ever known." "Mama says that too," Jenny said softly. "You said your mother is sick." "Yes, sir. She's been sick for about 3 weeks, but she won't go to the hospital because she says we don't have the money. She keeps saying she'll be fine, but tonight she was shaking really bad. And she won't eat anything and I'm scared." The voice trembled but held. This child was made of something remarkable, William thought. At 9 years old, in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve, calling a stranger to ask for help for her mother, and still holding herself together. "I was calling to ask. I know it's a lot to ask. But if you could maybe bring some food. Just something to eat. I have a little money I can pay you back. I've been saving." "Stop," William said gently. "You don't owe me anything. Not a single cent. What's your address, Jenny?" She gave it to him. A street in Bridgeport, 20 minutes south. William was already on his feet, reaching for his coat. "I'm coming," he said. "Right now. You stay with your mama and you keep her warm. Okay? I'll be there in less than half an hour." "Really?" The word came out barely above a whisper, cracked open with something that sounded like disbelief. The disbelief of a child who had learned too early not to expect much from the world. "Really?" William said. "I promise." He hung up the phone, grabbed his coat and his keys, and walked out into the Christmas Eve snow without looking back at the empty house, the untouched bourbon or the blinking tree. For the first time in 4 years he had somewhere to be. If you were William and you received this call on Christmas Eve from a little girl you had never met, would you have gone? Type yes or a no in the comments, and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. The address Jenny had given him was on Crescent Street, a narrow road in a part of Bridgeport that William had driven past but never through. The houses here were close together, their porches sagging slightly, their driveways patched with old asphalt. Christmas lights hung from a few of the windows, not the elaborate synchronized displays of his neighborhood, but single strands of colored bulbs, some half burned out, strung with the stubborn cheerfulness of people who refused to let the season go dark entirely. William parked his car, a black Range Rover that felt obscenely out of place on this street, and walked up the cracked front path to Unit 4B of a 2-story duplex. He knocked. A moment passed. Then the door opened and he looked down. Jenny Carter was small for 9, with wide dark eyes and a gap between her 2 front teeth. She was wearing a purple fleece pajama top, a pair of mismatched socks, and she had a dish towel draped over her shoulder the way someone much older might, like she'd been in the middle of doing something responsible when he knocked. Her hair was pulled back in 2 uneven puffs, and there was a determined set to her jaw that reminded William, with a sharpness that surprised him, of Marcus. She looked up at him for a long moment without saying anything. He was a tall white man in an expensive coat standing on her porch in the snow, and she examined him with the frank, uncalculating gaze of a child who has learned to read people quickly. "You came," she said finally. "I said I would." She stepped back and let him in. The apartment was small and clean. Clean in the way that speaks not of ease but of effort. Every surface wiped down, dishes stacked precisely. A small artificial Christmas tree on the kitchen table with paper ornaments that Jenny had clearly made herself, little hand-cut stars and angels with crayon faces. The heat, as she had said, was barely working. William could see his breath faintly. Ruth Carter was in the bedroom. She was lying under 2 blankets and a winter coat that had been laid over her like a quilt. She was a slender woman, perhaps mid-30s, with the same wide eyes as her daughter, though hers were glazed with fever. When William stepped into the doorway, she turned her head slowly and looked at him with the confused, suspended expression of someone who is not entirely sure what is real. "Who?" she started. "My name is William Hargrove," he said, moving to her side, crouching so he was level with her. "I was Marcus's friend. Jenny called me." Ruth's eyes moved from him to the doorway where Jenny stood, and something passed across her face, something between gratitude and a grief so old it had become ordinary. "Baby," she said to Jenny, her voice rough with fever, "you didn't have to." "Mama, you needed help," Jenny said simply. William pressed the back of his hand gently to Ruth's forehead. She was burning. "How long has she been like this?" he asked Jenny without turning around. "Getting worse for 3 days, Jenny said. Before that she just had a cough. But she won't stop working. She kept going to work even when she felt bad because she said if she missed a day Mr. Sloan would dock her pay. And then last week he fired her anyway and said she owed the company for damages, and that's why we haven't gotten any money this month." William turned to look at the girl. "Who is Mr. Sloan?" "Victor Sloan. He owns the factory where Mama works." "Worked." Jenny corrected herself quietly, the way children do when they are still getting used to the new version of something. "She worked there for 3 years. She never missed a day until she got sick." William stood. He had heard the name Victor Sloan before, somewhere in the periphery of his business world, a manufacturing operation mid-size somewhere in the Connecticut-New York corridor. He filed it away. There would be time for that later. Right now there was a woman burning with fever under a winter coat because she could not afford a hospital bill. "We need to get your mother to a hospital," William said. "We can't pay." "That's not your concern tonight," he said firmly. "Jenny, put your coat and shoes on. We're going right now." Jenny looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, turned, and went to get her coat. She did not argue, did not question, did not waste a single second on doubt. She was 9 years old and she was already built like someone who knew that when a door opens, you walk through it. William called ahead to Bridgeport Hospital on the way, spoke to the attending physician in the emergency department, and by the time they arrived, Ruth Carter was taken back within minutes. Jenny sat beside William in the waiting room, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching the doors through which her mother had disappeared. "She's going to be okay," William said. "Can I ask you something?" Jenny said after a moment. "Of course. Did you really know my daddy? Like really know him, not just a little bit?" "He was my best friend," William said. "We met in college. He was the funniest person I've ever known and also the most stubborn. We argued about basketball every single time we talked. He was a Knicks fan and I thought that was the worst decision a person could make." Jenny almost smiled. "He has a Knicks hat in Mama's box." "Of course he does." William looked at the girl. "I'm sorry I didn't know about him sooner. I'm sorry I wasn't there." Jenny was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I think he would be glad you're here now." She said it the way children sometimes say true things, without ceremony, without sentiment, just as a fact. Like she was reading something off a page that only she could see. William nodded and said nothing. Above them the fluorescent lights hummed. Down the hall behind closed doors doctors worked. The night stretched long and cold outside the hospital windows, but in that waiting room, something that had been knotted tight inside William Hargrove's chest for 4 years began, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. This little girl walked her sick mother through freezing temperatures with nothing but a 9-year-old's courage and a phone number written on the back of an old photograph. Does this child remind you of anyone you know, someone who was strong when they had every right to fall apart? Tell us in the comments. They would not let Jenny into the ICU. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia with a Georgia drawl and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, explained it gently, and Jenny accepted it with a gravity that made Patricia glance over her head at William with a look that asked, quietly, "What is the story with this child?" William gave a small shake of his head. Later, he stayed. It did not occur to him not to. He found a corner of the waiting room with 2 chairs facing each other, and he and Jenny sat across from one another. And because neither of them wanted to talk about what might be happening behind those doors, they talked about other things. Jenny told him about her teacher, Ms. Okafor, who gave out gold star stickers for correct math answers and who always smelled like cinnamon. She told him that her favorite book was Charlotte's Web, that she had read it 4 times, and that she cried every single time even though she knew what was going to happen. She told him that she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, so she could help people who didn't have money to go to the hospital. "That's a good reason to be a doctor," William said. "What did you want to be when you were little?" she asked. William thought about it honestly. "A pilot," he said. "I wanted to fly planes." "Why didn't you?" "My father wanted me to go into business. And I was good at it, so I did." He paused. "Sometimes I still think about it." "You should do what makes you happy," Jenny said. "Mama always says that. She says life is too short not to." William looked at the girl and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. It was just past 1 in the morning when Dr. Ellison came through the doors. He was a man in his 50s with careful eyes and the practiced stillness of someone who has delivered bad news enough times to know that how you stand and how you breathe matters as much as the words. William knew before the man opened his mouth. He stood up, instinctively stepping slightly in front of Jenny. "Mr. Hargrove, Dar," Ellison said quietly. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped a few feet away. Jenny watched them from her chair, her hands folded again in her lap, very still. She came in with advanced pneumonia on top of what appears to be untreated hypertension and severe exhaustion. Her immune system has been severely compromised. "We're doing everything we can, but I want to be honest with you. She's in critical condition." He paused. "She's been pushing her body past its limits for a very long time. Do you know if she has any family we should contact?" "I'll handle that," William said. His voice was steady. "What does she need?" "Right now she needs time and support. We've got her on 4 antibiotics and oxygen. But sir, I want you to prepare yourself, and more importantly, prepare the child." William nodded. He went back to Jenny and sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her. He thought about how to say it. He thought about Marcus, about how a child should never have to lose one parent, let alone 2. He thought about Ruth Carter working 3 years at a factory owned by a man who had ultimately discarded her like a broken machine. He thought about how he had been sitting alone in his house 2 hours ago with an untouched glass of bourbon, and how the world had pivoted on the phone call of a 9-year-old girl. "Jenny," he said. "She's really sick," Jenny said. It was not a question. She is. The doctors are helping her right now and they are very good at what they do. But I want to be honest with you because you are old enough and brave enough to hear the truth. It's serious. Jenny looked down at her hands. I prayed, she said, almost to herself. On the way here in the car, I was praying the whole time. I was talking to God and to Daddy. She looked up. Do you believe in God, Mr. Hargrove? The question landed without warning. William was not a man who talked about faith. He had grown up in a Presbyterian household in South Carolina, had drifted from it in college, from it further in the years of ambition and accumulation, and then when his wife had died on the table in the delivery room, when both she and the son they had named before he was born had died in the same terrible hour. He had stood outside that hospital and felt something close to rage at the idea of any arrangement in the universe that could call itself good. But sitting next to this child in this waiting room on Christmas morning, he thought about the photograph on the back of which Marcus Carter had written a phone number. He thought about a 9-year-old girl finding it by accident while looking for a blanket. He thought about every link in that chain. I think, he said slowly, that some things happen that I can't explain any other way. Jenny seemed to accept that. She nodded. Then she leaned very slightly, almost without seeming to mean to, against his arm. He didn't move. They sat there together and the night got later and the hospital hummed around them, and somewhere behind closed doors Ruth Carter fought. She lost the fight at 3:47 in the morning. A 9-year-old girl alone in a hospital waiting room on Christmas morning, praying to both God and her dead father at the same time. Do you believe that God places certain people in our lives exactly when we need them most? Share what you believe in the comments below. Dr. Ellison came back alone. He didn't need to say anything. Jenny read it in his face before he spoke. The way children who have been watching adults for signs their whole short lives learn to read a room faster than anyone gives them credit for. She made a sound, small, sharp, like something snapping, and William put his arm around her shoulders and she turned her face into his coat and cried. Not loudly. Not with the abandon of a child throwing a tantrum. She cried quietly and terribly, the way people cry when they are trying to hold on to themselves, when they understand that falling apart completely is a luxury they cannot afford. William held her. He did not say it was going to be okay. He had learned the hard way that those words were a kindness people offered for their own comfort, not the grieving person's. He held her and he said nothing and he let her cry for as long as she needed. When she finally pulled back, her eyes red and swollen, she looked up at him and said, What happens to me now? It was the most practical question in the world and it broke his heart completely. You're going to come home with me, he said. He had not planned to say it. It was not the product of legal deliberation or strategic thinking. It came from somewhere older and more certain than either of those things. If that's okay with you. Jenny looked at him for a long moment. You really knew my daddy? He was my best friend in the world. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Okay, she said. He wrapped her in his coat as they walked out to the car. The snow had stopped. The world was very white and very quiet. It was Christmas morning, a little past 4, and the stars were out. Jenny looked up at them as he opened the car door for her. He did not know what she was looking for. He did not ask. In the days that followed, William moved with the kind of focused efficiency that had made him successful in business, because he understood that action was the only antidote to helplessness. He arranged for Ruth's funeral, a dignified, proper service, attended by a handful of neighbors from Crescent Street who came with covered dishes and shining eyes and told Jenny that her mama had been the kind of woman who would give you her last dollar and then apologize for not having more. He began the legal process for emergency guardianship, his attorneys working through the holiday week to file the appropriate petitions. and he called in a favor from an old contact at a financial investigations firm in Stamford. "I need everything you can find on a man named Victor Sloan," he said, "and on a workplace accident approximately 3 years ago at any facility he owns or has owned. I want every safety record, every OSHA filing, every insurance claim. I want to know what happened." The contact paused. "This personal?" "Very," William said. "Ruth Carter worked 3 years without a single day off for a man who fired her the moment she got sick, then left her without a dollar to her name. She died on Christmas morning in a hospital bed, while her 9-year-old daughter waited outside. Does this story break your heart the way it breaks ours? Leave a comment and tell us. And tell us what city and country you are watching from tonight, because you are not watching alone." The report arrived on the 28th of December, 4 days after Christmas, delivered as a secure encrypted file to William's laptop. He read it at the kitchen table while Jenny was in the next room watching a movie, the first animated film she had asked to watch, cautiously, as if unsure whether she was allowed to want something cheerful this soon. He had told her yes immediately and set it up for her himself. Victor Sloan was 53 years old and had been running Sloan Industrial Manufacturing for 17 years. On the surface, the company was unremarkable: metal components, mid-tier contracts, a workforce of about 200 people spread across 2 facilities in Connecticut. But underneath the surface, the investigator had found a different story. 3 years ago, a man named Marcus Carter had died at the Sloan facility in Shelton. The official report, filed with the State Labor Department, attributed the death to an equipment malfunction, a standard industrial accident, tragic but not criminally negligent. The file had been closed. But the investigator had found something the official report had not included: a safety audit conducted internally by Sloan Industrial 6 weeks before the accident had flagged the exact piece of equipment that had malfunctioned. The audit recommended immediate repair and temporary shutdown of that line. The recommendation had been signed off on by the floor supervisor, and then overridden in writing by Victor Sloan himself, who had noted in the margin that shutting the line down would delay a contract deadline and cost the company money. 6 weeks later, Marcus Carter died on that line. The investigator had also found, through a source at the State Labor Board, that Ruth Carter had attempted to raise the question of the safety audit when she first joined the company, approximately a year after Marcus died. She had heard about the audit from a coworker. Sloan had learned of her inquiry and had made her working conditions progressively more difficult: reduced hours, punitive shift assignments, intimidation, while keeping her employed just long enough to avoid a wrongful termination suit. Then, when she fell ill and became a liability, he had fired her and concocted a fictitious damages claim to prevent her from filing for unemployment benefits. William sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he finished reading. The movie played in the other room. He could hear the music of it. Something bright and orchestral, a cartoon world where things worked out. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was still buried in snow, white and clean and absolute. Marcus had died because Victor Sloan had decided a contract deadline was worth more than a man's life. Ruth had died because Sloan had ground her down for 3 years, stripped away her livelihood, and left her without the resources to treat a preventable illness. Jenny had grown up without a father and had now lost her mother too, and had spent Christmas Eve calling a stranger to ask for food because the alternative was starvation. And Victor Sloan had gone home every night to his house in Westport, Connecticut, a 6-bedroom colonial on 2 acres, according to the property records included in the file, and had slept without apparent difficulty. William picked up his phone and called his lead attorney. "I need you to listen very carefully," he said. "We're going to file a civil suit. And before we file it, I want to make sure every relevant regulatory agency in the state of Connecticut has received an anonymous tip directing them to review the Sloan Industrial Safety Audit from 3 years ago and the subsequent override. OSHA, the State Labor Department, the Attorney General's office. All of them. William, if this goes public. It's going to go very public, William said. That's the point. Victor Sloan knew that machine was broken. He was warned in writing 6 weeks before Marcus Carter died. He chose a contract deadline over a man's life, and then spent 3 years destroying the man's widow to cover his tracks. Do you think a man like this deserves to walk free? Or do you believe that what is done in darkness always comes to light? Tell us what you think. January came in cold and iron gray, and William Hargrove's life rearranged itself in ways he had not anticipated and did not resist. Jenny moved into the guest room that had, in the week since she arrived, ceased to be a guest room and become something else entirely. She had unpacked her few belongings carefully, some clothes, Charlotte's Web, the photograph of Marcus and William, and the small paper ornament Christmas tree from the kitchen table on Crescent Street, which she had asked if she could bring and which now sat on the windowsill of her room, slightly lopsided, absolutely irreplaceable. She was a child of extraordinary interior weather. In the morning she sometimes came downstairs red-eyed and quiet, and William learned not to fill those silences with cheerful noise. He would make breakfast, eggs, toast, orange juice, and set it in front of her and sit across from her with his coffee and read the paper, and sometimes she would eat and say nothing, and sometimes she would start talking about her mother, about her father, about something she had dreamed. He listened. He discovered, better at listening than he had given himself credit for. Other times she was 9 years old with the full chaotic vitality that implies. She found the library on the second floor and systematically began working through its shelves. She asked to help cook dinner and proved to have inherited some version of Ruth Carter's competence, carefully following recipes with a focus that brooked no distraction. She had opinions about everything, firm, considered, unsentimental opinions, delivered in that direct way of hers that made adults blink. She was enrolled in a school in Greenwich in the second week of January. On the first morning, William drove her. She was quiet the whole way, looking out the window at the unfamiliar streets. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little." She paused. "I'm the only black kid in my grade," she said. It was not a complaint. It was an observation, delivered with the matter-of-factness of someone doing an accurate count. "How do you know?" "I looked at the school website." William glanced at her. "Is that going to be a problem for you?" "I don't know yet," Jenny said honestly. "It wasn't at my old school. But this is different." She turned from the window to look at him. "Is it going to be a problem for you? Having a black kid at your school?" The directness of it startled him into silence for half a second. "No," he said. "It's your school. And I don't want you to feel like you have to fit yourself into anything that doesn't fit you. If anyone gives you trouble, you tell me." Jenny nodded, apparently satisfied. She went back to looking out the window. "My daddy used to say that people who care about the color of your skin instead of the content of your character are just people who are scared," she said. "He said fear makes people small." "Your daddy was right," William said. She got out of the car, adjusted her backpack straps, and walked into the school without looking back. He watched her go and felt something in his chest that he did not immediately have a word for. It was something in the neighborhood of awe. She came home that afternoon with a library book checked out from the school library, and the name of a girl named Sophie who had sat next to her in math and who had, apparently, correct opinions about Charlotte's Web. William made hot chocolate and they sat at the kitchen table, and Jenny told him about the day with the measured thoroughness of a field reporter filing a careful brief. He was falling in love with this child. Not romantically, not paternally in the biological sense, but in the way that a person falls in love with something that is both a gift and a responsibility, something that arrives in your life and reorganizes every room. Meanwhile, the machinery of accountability was turning. Jenny walked into a brand new school where she was the only black child in her grade, carrying the grief of losing both her parents, and she still came home with a new friend and a library book. Do you think the color of a person's skin should ever matter in how we treat them? And has a child ever taught you something about courage that you still carry with you today? We want to hear your story. The regulatory investigations opened quietly, as these things do. A letter from the Connecticut Department of Labor. A notification from OSHA. These were bureaucratic instruments, slow-moving and unsexy, and under ordinary circumstances Victor Sloan might have deployed his legal team to slow-walk them into indefinite delay, which is what powerful men with expensive lawyers generally do when inconvenient questions are asked by government agencies. But William Hargrove was not operating through government agencies alone. He had given the full file, the safety audit, the override memo, the documented campaign against Ruth Carter, the insurance records, the labor violations, to a journalist at the Hartford Courant named Sandra Reeves, whom he had known for a decade and trusted absolutely. He had also shared it with a producer at a national news program who owed him a favor, and who, once she read the material, no longer needed the leverage of the favor to be interested. "You understand," Sandra had said when William handed her the file, "that this is going to be very loud." "Good," William said. The story broke on January 19th. Sandra's piece ran first in the Courant and was picked up nationally within hours. It detailed with documentary precision how Victor Sloan had overridden a safety audit, how Marcus Carter had died on a machine that was already flagged as dangerous, how the company had manipulated the official accident report, and how Sloan had subsequently spent 3 years systematically dismantling the life of Marcus's widow. The national segment aired that evening. William watched it on the television in the living room with Jenny, who had asked to watch. He had considered whether to show her. He had decided that she had a right to know what had happened to her parents, and that keeping the truth from her was a disrespect she had not earned. She watched with her knees pulled up to her chest and her eyes very still. When the segment ended, she was quiet for a long moment. "They showed Daddy's picture," she said. "They did. They said his name right." She said it like this mattered enormously, which it did. "Marcus Anthony Carter," William said. "That's his name." She uncurled slightly. "What happens to Mr. Sloan now?" "There will be investigations. Civil suits. Potentially criminal charges depending on what the Attorney General decides. He's going to lose a great deal." "Good," Jenny said. It was not said with heat or satisfaction. It was said the way she said most things, plainly as a statement of what was right. Victor Sloan's attorneys issued a statement the following morning. It was the kind of statement attorneys issue when the evidence is devastating and the client is indefensible, technically denying specific claims while failing to provide any counter-narrative, full of language like deeply concerned and committed to safety that convinced no one. The company's contracts began to evaporate within the week. The facility in Shelton was placed under mandatory review. A grand jury was convened by February. Sloan's personal assets were frozen in connection with the civil suit filed by William's attorneys on behalf of Jenny Carter, the sole surviving heir of Marcus Carter, whose death had now been legally reclassified as resulting from criminal negligence. When Jenny watched the news report and heard her father's name spoken correctly on national television for the first time, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "They said his name right." That is all she said. Does that moment move you the way it moves us? Tell us in the comments. And tell us where you are watching from, because tonight people in every corner of the world are hearing the name Marcus Anthony Carter. The funeral for Ruth Elaine Carter was held on the 27th of December, 3 days after Christmas, at a small funeral home on Stratford Avenue in Bridgeport. William had arranged everything quietly and without fuss, the way he handled things that mattered, not with the ostentatious gestures of a man spending money to be seen spending it, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that dignity is not a luxury reserved for people who can afford it. He chose a casket that was simple and good. He ordered flowers, white lilies and deep red roses, because Jenny had mentioned without being asked that her mother's favorite color was red. He made sure the room was warm. He had not expected many people to come. Ruth Carter had lived a life made small by circumstance. Long hours, little money, no surplus of time for the kind of social cultivation that fills a room at a funeral. But the neighbors came. They came from Crescent Street and from the streets around it, women in their good coats and men with their hats in their hands, people who had borrowed eggs from Ruth and returned flour, people whose children had played with Jenny on the front step in the summers, people who had seen a light on in her window at midnight and known she was still at it, still working, still holding the whole fragile construction of their small life together with both hands. A woman named Darlene, who had lived in the unit above Ruth's for 2 years, stood up without being asked and spoke for 7 minutes without notes. She said that Ruth Carter was the kind of woman who noticed things, who noticed when your face looked tired, who knocked on your door with a plate of food without making you feel like charity, who asked how your mother was doing and actually listened to the answer. She said Ruth had told her once that she was saving up to go back to school, to get her nursing certification, because she wanted to do something that helped people directly with her hands. She said Ruth had believed that God put people on earth to be useful to one another, and had lived every day of her life accordingly. Jenny sat in the front row in a dark blue dress William had taken her to buy the morning before. She sat very straight and listened to everything. She did not cry during the service. She cried once, briefly, at the end when the music played. An old hymn, His Eye is on the Sparrow, played on a small organ by a volunteer from a local Baptist congregation who had heard about the service through Reverend Harris and come without being asked. The notes filled the small room and Jenny put her face in her hands for exactly 1 minute, and then she lifted her head and straightened her back and did not look down again. William sat beside her. He thought about his own wife's funeral 4 years ago, in a much larger church in a much wealthier part of the world, surrounded by people who had known her socially and professionally and who had said the right things in the right order. He had sat through that service feeling entirely alone. He did not feel alone now. He felt the weight of Jenny's shoulder against his arm, light as a bird, steady as a stone. Afterward, in the parking lot, as people drifted to their cars in the gray December cold, a man approached William. He was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of physical work. He introduced himself as Gerald Monroe, a former co-worker of Marcus Carter's at the Sloan facility. "I heard about what happened," Gerald said. He meant Ruth. He meant all of it. "I've been carrying something for 3 years that I didn't know what to do with." He looked at William steadily. "I was there the week before Marcus died. I saw the audit. I saw what Sloan wrote in the margin. I told Marcus about it. He said he was going to talk to the floor supervisor." Gerald paused. "I've been living with that ever since, wondering if I'd done something different, if he'd still be here." William looked at the man. "You didn't kill Marcus," he said. "Sloan killed Marcus, and I'm going to make sure that is on the record. Permanently." Gerald nodded slowly. Then he said, "Whatever you need from me, testimony, statement, whatever it takes, I'll do it. I'll have my attorney contact you this week," William said. They shook hands in the cold parking lot, and Gerald Monroe walked back to his car, and William stood for a moment alone in the gray December air and thought about the way that the truth, once it starts moving, finds its way to the surface through cracks you did not know were there. It moves slowly sometimes. It waits in the conscience of a coworker for 3 years, in the memory of a safety auditor, in a document filed and forgotten in a company server. It waits until someone with the means and the motive to pull it into the light comes along and does exactly that. He thought about Victor Sloan in his 6-bedroom house in Westport, very possibly sitting down to the last peaceful dinner he would have for a long time, unaware that the machinery of his undoing had been set in motion by a 9-year-old girl who had found a telephone number on the back of a photograph while looking for a blanket. There was something almost theological about it, William thought. The kind of architecture that a certain kind of believer would call providence, and that even a skeptic had to pause in front of if they were paying attention. He went back inside to find Jenny. She was in the corner of the reception room with Darlene, the neighbor who had spoken, and 2 other women whose names William did not yet know. Jenny was listening to them with that full serious attention she gave to everything. One of the women was laughing softly at something, and Jenny almost smiled, and the sight of it, this child in the middle of her grief still reaching toward warmth, still leaning into connection the way a plant leans toward whatever light is available, stopped William in the doorway for a moment. He thought about what Reverend Harris would later say about children who are sent. He thought about it standing in the doorway of a funeral home in Bridgeport, in the week between Christmas and New Year, while the winter afternoon turned the windows pale gold. He crossed the room to stand beside her, and she looked up at him and said nothing, just shifted slightly to include him in the circle, the way she had been including him in things since the first night he had walked into her apartment on Crescent Street and crouched beside her mother's bed. As if he had always been meant to be there. As if she had simply been waiting for him to arrive. Some people come into your life like a storm. Others come like a door quietly opening in a wall you had stopped believing had a door. This little girl buried her mother 3 days after Christmas with more grace than most adults could manage in a lifetime. If Ruth Carter's story stays with you, drop her name in the comments. Let the whole world know that Ruth Elaine Carter lived, and that she mattered, and that she raised a daughter who will carry her light forward. Tell us where you are watching from tonight. On the first Sunday in February, William and Jenny went to church. It was Jenny's idea. She had asked him one evening at dinner whether he went to church. He had said no, not for a long time. She had said that she and her mama used to go every Sunday to a Baptist church near their apartment, and that she missed it, and asked whether he would take her. He had said yes without deliberating. The church she chose was not in Greenwich. She had researched it herself, again via the internet, with that quiet systematic competence that still caught him off guard, and found a Baptist church in Bridgeport, 10 minutes from the street where she had lived. New Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, established 1959. She had looked at photographs of the congregation online. It looks like my old church, she said. It looks like people I know. They drove down on a Sunday morning, William in a plain navy coat, Jenny in a burgundy dress that Mrs. Aldrich had taken her to buy the previous week, and that Jenny wore with the precise dignity of someone who understood the occasion. They were, in the parking lot and then in the pew, the most conspicuous possible pair. A tall white man and a small black girl, her hand in his, walking into a sanctuary that smelled like wood polish and hymnals. No one asked them to explain themselves. The pastor, a broad-shouldered man named Reverend Gideon Harris, preached that morning about the story of Ruth and Naomi, 2 women, bound not by blood but by loyalty and love, navigating loss and displacement and finding their way to something new. William sat in the wooden pew and listened with the full attention he usually reserved for important negotiations, and felt the words land differently than he expected. The congregation sang. Jenny sang with them. She knew the hymns or enough of them, and her voice was clear and unself-conscious and absolutely certain. William did not sing. He had not sung in church since childhood. But he sat beside her and listened to the singing and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, some thawing at the edges of a cold place inside him, and he thought about his wife and about Marcus, and about the strange and terrible and somehow luminous path that had led him to this pew on this morning. After the service, Reverend Harris shook William's hand and said, "She's been praying for you, you know. She told me." William looked at him. "She prayed for me?" Harris smiled. "Said she prayed for her daddy's friend every night since she called you. Said she didn't know if he was a praying man, but she figured God would relay the message." He looked at Jenny, who was across the room talking to a pair of older women who were admiring her dress. "That is a child who was sent," he said. "Doesn't come along often. But when they do, you know it." William looked at Jenny too. He thought about a telephone number written on the back of a photograph, sitting in a box under a bed for years waiting. "Yes," he said. "You know it." On the way home, Jenny was quiet in a full, satisfied way, the quiet of someone who has been fed, in every sense of the word. She looked out the window and after a while she said, "Thank you for coming with me." "Thank you for asking me," William said. She thought about this. "I think Mama and Daddy would be happy," she said. "I think they'd think it was funny too. A little bit. Yeah. You walking into that church." A small smile at the corner of her mouth. "You looked like you didn't know what to do with your hands." William laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind he had not heard come out of himself in longer than he could precisely calculate. Jenny laughed too, and the sound of it filled the car. And outside the February sky was pale and wide and the road ran ahead of them straight and clear. A 9-year-old girl had been praying for a man she had never met, every single night, because she believed God would relay the message. And he did. Do you believe that prayer can reach across the distance between two strangers and pull them together? Type Amen if you believe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. By the time the cherry trees in William's garden began to think about blooming, the shape of their life together had begun to settle into something recognizable, not as a temporary arrangement or a charitable intervention, but as a family, the specific, irreducible, slightly improbable kind that forms not from biology but from choice and circumstance and the strange mercy of timing. Victor Sloan was indicted on 4 counts in March: criminal negligence, falsification of safety records, fraud, and labor violations. His attorney negotiated a plea on 3 of the 4 counts. He received a sentence of 6 years, with eligibility for parole after 3. It was not, William knew enough. It would not bring Marcus back. It would not restore the years Ruth had spent working herself to the bone for a man who saw her as expendable. But it was a public accounting, documented and on the record, and Marcus Anthony Carter's name was in that record, and Ruth Carter's name was in that record, and what had been done to them was named and adjudicated and could not be undone or denied. Jenny took the news with the same gravity she brought to most things. She was quiet that evening. Then she asked if she could call Reverend Harris, and William handed her his phone, and she went into the library and had a conversation he was not privy to and returned 20 minutes later looking steadier. The guardianship was formalized in April. William's attorneys had navigated the process with efficiency and care, and the judge, a woman in her 60s who had reviewed the file and asked Jenny one question in chambers, to which Jenny had given an answer that apparently satisfied her entirely, signed the order on a Thursday morning. William took Jenny out for lunch afterward at a restaurant of her choosing. She chose a diner, ordered pancakes despite the fact that it was noon, and ate them with the calm pleasure of someone who has made an excellent decision and knows it. "Are you happy?" he asked her. She considered the question seriously, which is the only way she considered any question. "I'm sad and happy at the same time," she said. "I miss Mama. I miss Daddy. I think I'm always going to miss them." She looked at him. "But I'm also really glad I called you." "So am I," he said. "The most glad I've been about anything in a long time." She twirled a piece of pancake in the syrup. "Miss Okafor, my new teacher. She says that in Nigerian culture there's a belief that the people who love you don't really go away. They just move to a different place and they watch from there." She paused. "I like that." "I like that too," William said. "I think Mama sent me to find that picture," Jenny said. "I think she knew somehow. Or maybe Daddy arranged it from wherever he is." She glanced up at him. "Is that weird to believe?" "No," he said. "I think that's exactly right." She smiled. Full unguarded, the gap between her two front teeth and everything. It was a smile that had been appearing more frequently in the past weeks, filling up rooms the way light fills a room when you open the curtains, making everything slightly different, slightly warmer, slightly more possible. In the months that followed, life continued in the way that lives do. Not in straight lines, not in clean narratives with resolved endings, but in the complicated accumulation of ordinary days that together amount to something. Jenny started a photography club at school. She read 9 more books and began working on what she called a list of things she wanted to understand before she was 12. She won a math competition in May and came home with a ribbon that she immediately hung on the wall of her room, next to the lopsided paper Christmas tree. William, for his part, found himself changed in ways that were not dramatic or sudden but real. He started attending New Bethel Missionary Baptist with Jenny most Sundays. He did not convert, did not dramatically reconstruct his theology, did not announce anything to anyone. He simply sat in the pew and listened and felt the slow return of something he had not known he was missing. He began to believe, not in easy answers or in a God who prevented suffering, but in the possibility of meaning, in the idea that even the worst things could be part of a story that was still being told, that loss did not have to be the last word. He thought about Marcus, and he grieved him properly, for the first time, in the presence of the daughter who was Marcus's living continuation. He thought about his wife and his son, and allowed himself to hold both the grief and the present moment at the same time, which is perhaps the hardest thing any human being is ever asked to do. One evening in June, Jenny came into his study where he was working and sat down across from him without preamble. "I've been thinking," she said. "Tell me. When I grow up and become a doctor," she said, "I want to work in places where people can't afford health care. Like Mama couldn't. I want to make it so that what happened to her doesn't happen to other people." She looked at him steadily. "Will you help me? Like later? When I'm older? I know you know people and know how to do things." "Yes," he said immediately. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it. That's a promise." She nodded, satisfied, stood, and went back to whatever she had been doing before. He watched the door close behind her and sat for a moment in the quiet of the study, the evening light coming through the window, the garden visible beyond the glass, the cherry trees full now, past blooming, green and settled into summer. He had come back to this country 4 years ago with nothing left that mattered. He had sat in this house through 4 Christmas Eves and watched the season pass from the wrong side of a window. And then a 9-year-old girl with a gap between her teeth and her father's stubborn jaw had found a phone number on the back of a photograph, and had been brave enough to dial it, and everything that had been stopped had started again. The righteous are not always rewarded in the ways the world considers reward. The wicked are not always punished on the timetable that justice demands. These are the hardest truths of being alive, and no sermon resolves them cleanly. But William Hargrove had come to believe, sitting in a pew in Bridgeport, watching a child sing hymns she had learned beside her mother, watching the light fall through old stained glass onto old wood, that goodness persists. That love finds its way through the narrowest passage. That even in the longest night, in the coldest hour, someone will sometimes pick up the phone. And if you are the one who receives that call, the only question that matters is what you do next. Jenny Carter had asked for a little food on Christmas Eve. What she got and what she gave was everything else. Victor Sloan received 6 years in prison for what he did to Marcus Carter and Ruth Carter. Some people will say that is not enough. Others will say that justice, however incomplete, is still justice. What do you say? Is 6 years enough for a man who knowingly let another man die, and then spent 3 years destroying that man's family? Tell us what you think. And if this story moved you, share it with someone you love tonight. Because somewhere in the world right now, there is a child who just needs someone to pick up the phone.